morning, Trinidad and Tobago. I'm Soini Gray. I'm here with Andy Knight, a professor of political science at the University of Alberta in Canada. Professor Knight is also the former director of the Department of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. And we're here to discuss the Panama Papers and its impact on the region. So if you didn't know, the Panama Papers refers to the leak of 11.5 million files from Mossack Fonseca, the world's fourth largest offshore law firm, which is based in Panama, hence the name. The leak has implicated 143 politicians worldwide. Most notably, it's forced the resignation of Iceland's prime minister. Over in the United Kingdom, Prime Minister David Cameron is fending off attacks from those who say he benefited from an investment his father made in a Panamanian trust. So I want to ask Professor Knight, what can those responses show us about how those countries, the UK and Iceland, view tax avoidance schemes?
Well, this is I know that most listeners are probably realizing that Bernie Sanders, for example, been talking for a long time about the fact that the top 1% of the population earns more than the bottom 99% of the population. This has a lot to do with governance and transparency, or lack of transparency, the need for, I think, for very rich people to find loopholes in the law in order to be able to have their, try to avoid paying taxes to their countries. So I think this has a lot to do with governance, the issue of governance and transparency. And the fact that you have the Prime Minister of Iceland resigning over this, you're probably going to have David Cameron, as you said, fending off opposition to his particular take on this, but also other leaders like Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China. A lot of other leaders are sort of linked to this scandal because of the fact that they're trying to hide something. I would imagine, either through themselves or friends or family members in the Panama situation.
But what's interesting about the Putin response is that he seems unaffected by the leak. And I think I've heard Russian journalists and public speakers saying that it's just simply anti-Russian propaganda, that it's not true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a way of sort of countering what I think has happened, which is that they've been now exposed in terms of their financial dealings. While Putin himself may not have been named in the Panama Papers, some of his very, very close friends and family members are. So I don't think it's really an attempt to try to belittle Putin, and this is not an anti-Russian situation, as you can tell. This 11.5 million documents out there that shows that there is a problem in terms of lack of transparency. There is a problem in terms of offshore shell companies being developed in order to be able to hide revenues that individuals have, and also to help them to avoid paying taxes to their country.
What kind of impact could this have on the Caribbean?
Well, I think the Caribbean is, many countries within the Caribbean would like to be able to benefit from having investments, right, in those countries. So they've been able to use their position as small island states in order to be able to give tax breaks to the wealthy. This is a way of attracting financial capital into the countries.
Right.
So I think Caribbean countries tend to be very, very vulnerable when it comes to this issue, and particularly the British overseas territories, like BVI, British Virgin Islands, and countries like that, the Seychelles and so on. They are basically proxies, for some of the big companies in the UK, in the United States, in Russia, that are trying to hide their revenues in these places, and they provide tax havens for those people. It's a way of keeping finances within those small countries that more or less are fairly vulnerable financially without it.
But is there a risk? I mean, the Mossack Fonseca breach, could potentially paint Panama in a bad light. We have islands, countries in the Caribbean, like the Cayman Island, the BVI, which
Yeah.
have reputations as offshore tax havens. Can they
Yeah.
also be painted in a bad light, made to the assumption is that they are corrupt by offering these facilities?
Yes, but at the same time, we want to be fair to those countries as well because there's nothing really wrong with having, with having tax havens per se. What's wrong is when you have corruption, illicit financing, when you have individuals avoiding to pay their taxes in their own countries, hiding their money somewhere else. I think that's where the sort of ethical and moral dilemma comes in for those countries, for those small island Caribbean states. You'll notice that Panama is simply, Panama has the spotlight right now on Panama, but the Mossack Fonseca company was actually setting up some of these shell companies in places like BVI. These other island states within the Caribbean are affected almost directly because of what's happening in Panama.
And I just wanted to expand a bit on the implication that this breach and breaches like this can have on those economies or Caribbean
Yeah.
economies in general, because I know in the Caribbean we have a tendency to have like a one focus economy. So there's a lot of talk about economic diversification. Could
Mhm.
a breach like this for us in the region harm our efforts at diversifying our economy?
It could, but I think the pressure right now these days, especially with Transparency International and some of these other organizations, is to um, is to bring about a much more transparent system, so that there is less corruption in governance, so that there is a much more transparent way of demonstrating that the monies that are being used for investment purposes and so on in these countries are legitimate and licit funding, as opposed to illicit funding. You don't want to be tarnished by the reputation of being facilitators for money launderers, for example, or criminal activity. So I think many of these countries would be very, very, I think it'd be very good for those countries in the Caribbean to adhere to the basic principles of transparency, to adhere to what anti-corruption watchdogs are trying to do to make financial transactions much more legitimate and transparent.
Now, it's a lot of documents that were leaked, and they
Yeah.
say 143 politicians worldwide were affected. Are you aware of any significant major political figures in the region, if they were named or implicated in the papers?
Well, there's going to be a kind of a slow process of trying to reveal individuals who have been attached to this scandal. So right now, I only know about one individual per se in Trinidad, for example, who has been named, and in fact is now trying to fend off some attacks on this particular score. But I think eventually you're going to hear more and more names being linked to this. Now, so there are certain FIFA representatives, sports figures, celebrities that are also named along with politicians. So this is fairly wide, and 11.5 million documents to go through. I think there were about 300 journalists working feverishly trying to sort of glean and mine the information so they can pass it on to the public. So it's going to take a little while before we know for sure which Caribbean leaders or Caribbean people were involved in this scandal.
And how confident are you? I mean, it's not that there's one way our politicians behave in the Caribbean, but how confident are you that what do you expect for our politicians to react if they were in a Dave Cameron situation or the Iceland Prime Minister situation? Would you expect a resignation as quickly, or a willingness to appear to be transparent with your
Yeah,
financial dealings? Because we kind of don't have that history here, do we?
that's the problem. I think it would take the opposition of civil society, right, against these individuals to force them to resign, because more often than not they would. We hear about these scandals, different scandals happening from time to time, and individuals aren't held to account. So at some point in time, it takes somebody going to prison. It takes somebody, somebody high-profile person going to prison or something like that to bring an end to that kind of corruption. The biggest challenge for developing countries, of course, is that there is a fair amount of corruption in the political system. And how do you get around that if the civil society doesn't react, to that? I don't know how you're going to get around that. Now,
Do you have
I would
any
I would
ideas?
recommend I would recommend that that the people of the Caribbean should take a much more proactive role in holding their politicians to account for everything that they do, and in that way can sort of pressure politicians out of office if they are involved in any sort of money laundering schemes or financial corruption schemes in the future.
We saw a bit of that, I think, in Trinidad this year alone. We've seen like a slight rise in our civil society with the Nagakia, issue,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
another issue with the former Minister of Housing.
Right.
Why it is you think we seem to be averse, just very quickly, to civil society behavior in the Caribbean?
My own personal, I've been in the Caribbean for 3 years as director of the Institute of International Relations, and as a person from outside coming back into the region after such a long time of being away, I noticed a few things. One is that civil society is essentially very weak in the Caribbean. There are many other places around the globe where civil society is much stronger. For example, in Iceland, you had the Iceland Prime Minister was implicated, and his wife were implicated in the corruption scandal in Panama. Uh, and as a result, you had like 100,000 people or something like that coming out to protest against him, and then he's forced out of office after saying that he wasn't going to leave office. I don't see a lot of that sort of thing happening in the Caribbean. People tend to be a little bit more complacent for some reason when it comes to politics. It's almost as though you get the sense that they feel, there is corruption in the system, but we can't do very much about it.
Right.
Or there are certain people in high places, and I've heard about the so-called untouchables in Trinidad, for example, that you can't touch. They're wealthy people. They get away with a lot. There seem to be one set of rules for them and one set of rules for the other people
Correct.
in the population,
I
and
wanted to,
and get away with a lot. Yes,
Professor, we're running out of time, but I wanted to talk about, you have a new book coming out,
yes.
Female Suicide Bombings. It's a bit of a switch in topic. I wanted to talk about that because we've had a bit of a problem in Trinidad where we've had some of our young men go across, be radicalized by the so-called Islamic State. But your
Yes.
book is focusing on the female suicide bombers that
Yes.
groups like ISIS may or may not use. Should we be concerned about our women being vulnerable to radicalization?
Yes, and here's the thing. I've been doing some research while I was in Trinidad on the whole issue of foreign fighters, individuals that have been radicalized and become extremists and leave Trinidad and go off to fight in ISIS, with ISIS and in Syria and Iraq. The majority of those individuals, in fact, yes, I would say the majority of those individuals are males, and there's something like 89 to 90 people, believe it or not, from Trinidad alone
That's a high
who
number.
have gone over as foreign fighters. This is a large percentage of a population of 1.5 million or people or whatever you have there in Trinidad. So, but the tendency of intelligence bodies is to focus on young males, right, between 18 and 25 or something like this. So the profiling of young males sometimes leave young women under the radar. So you'll find a lot of terrorist organizations now are trying to target young women in order to have them become agents for their extremist attacks on various places. So you'll find that there's a lot more younger girls, young women being drawn into ISIS, being drawn into Boko Haram, some of the other Al Qaeda, some of the other terrorist organizations. So I don't think it'll be too long before you see
Women
some
starting to
young
be.
women in Trinidad, yeah, being drawn to this extremist ideology. It's
So,
just a matter
Professor
of
Knight,
time.
tell me the title of your book again and when it's going to be available.
Okay, it's called Female Suicide Bombings, A Gendered Approach, and we're looking basically at probably around June to August when the book is going to be out. Is University of Toronto Press, which is a very highly regarded press. and myself and Tony Naroshna, who is a Ukrainian background, who speaks Russian, by the way. So we've been able to do a lot of interviews in Russian in order to be able to capture some of the instances of female suicide bombing in, say, Chechnya, for example.
Right.
And we've been able to compare the various strategies used by women, within terrorist organizations in Sri Lanka, with the Tamil Tigers, also in Israel, in the Middle East, um, and also in various parts of the globe. There seems to be a contagion of this kind of element of females now being
Suicide
drawn
bombing.
into suicide bombings. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking for spending some time with us to talk to us about the Panama Papers and then about this new the phenomena of female suicide bombings. Thank you so much, Professor Knight, for your time and your expertise.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are going to go to a break. GMTT will continue after this short break.